Yes. Okay. Welcome everyone today to the further evaluation workshop for the Fogarty Creek Marine Conservation Area. My name is Andy Lanier. I'm the Marine Affairs Coordinator for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And we are here today to have a conversation about the Fogarty Creek Marine Conservation Area proposal, which was identified by both the working group and OPAC as a site for further evaluation as part of the OPAC Rocky Habitat Management Strategy proposal process. Quickly going into our agenda for today, I'm going to start out with a welcome and have everyone introduce themselves at the beginning, and I'll do a review of the agenda. And for the purposes of today's workshop, this really is an opportunity for the proposal lead to workshop the ideas that were in their proposal with the agencies who were a big part of the review of the proposals during the evaluation of the sites. Following today's workshop, the proposers will be able to provide a cover letter which will be included in a packet. And as agencies, I will summarize the discussion and any remaining considerations that may be concerning to agencies with if the site were to move forward. Those will all be packaged together with materials and then transmitted to OPAC, the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. At the next OPAC meeting, the proposers will have an opportunity to present to OPAC their proposal and to have a question and answer and a dialogue session with members of the council. And then at the following Ocean Policy Advisory Council meeting, we've asked OPAC to vote on whether or not to move any of the sites forward. So the way that I've structured the workshop today, it's really a dialogue between the lead proposer and the agencies to try and identify where any of the kind of remaining issues, if there are any, kind of what the makeup of those issues is and what potential concerns or potential alternatives to resolve those may be. But we will start off with an opportunity for public comment to hear from anyone who wants to provide their perspective or their opinion about the proposal that can be useful to inform our discussion. I will then very briefly summarize our tribal consultative responsibilities as agencies. If any of these designations were to move forward, we as a state have a responsibility to do so. And then we're going to allow up to 30 minutes for the lead proposer or the proposer team to give us a presentation about their site. We'll then take a break, and then following the break, we'll come back and get into the meat of our discussion. We'll kind of close out with about 15 minutes left with kind of summary of the workshop wrap up and next steps, and then we'll adjourn. Does anyone have any questions about the plan for today? Looks like we got a few more in the waiting room. I'm going to admit all of those. And I may need to cover some of those points again for the benefit of the attendees who just joined us. So what I'd like to start with is introductions. I've already introduced myself, but I'd like to go ahead and let the proposal lead introduce herself. Fran, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for showing up. I'm Fran Recht. I live in Depot Bay. I work for Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, managing their habitat program. I'm on the City Council of Depot Bay, but I'm here as a member of the public today, informed member of the public. And in full disclosure, I just got appointed to the OPAC as a local government representative. So I'll have to deal with legal counsel on what I can do in the upcoming meeting. But anyway, that's me, and I thank you all for all your time you're putting into this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. Let's go then to our agency panelists, and I'm gonna call your name out as you appear on my little tiled video screens. Why don't we begin with Laurel, then Guy, then Jared.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Laurel Hillman, Ocean Shore Resource Specialist with Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. Happy to be here today.
Morning, everyone. Guy Rodriguez. I'm the Central Resource Manager, including the Ocean Shores Program for Oregon State Parks.
Good morning. I'm Jared Mantini, the Park Manager for the Beverly Beach State Park Management Unit.
Thank you. Sean?
My name is Sean Stevenson. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm the wildlife biologist at the Oregon Coast National Wildlife Refuge Complex.
Thank you. Blake?
Hello, I'm Blake Helm, Proprietary Specialist with the Oregon Department of State Lands.
And then Dave Fox.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Dave Fox, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Marine Resources Program.
And then Moses.
Hi everyone, I'm Michael Moses, former Rocky Shores Coordinator, current Estuarine Resilience Coordinator at the LCD.
So that, I think, is all of our panelists. And now I'm going to go to members of the public today that I see on my screen. And I'll start with Peggy. Oh, you're on mute, Peggy.
Sorry.
There you are.
I'm Peggy Joyce, and I'm a newly appointed member of the OPAC board.
Thank you. Jamie.
Jamie Faraday. I am a retired teacher and the Coastal at-large OPAC member.
Thank you. Nora.
Hi, I'm Nora Sherwood in Lincoln City with the Lincoln City Audubon Society.
Thank you, Nora. Dick.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dick Vanderschaft with the Nature Conservancy. I was a member of the Rocky Habitat Working Group.
And last but not least, Charlie.
Good morning, everyone. Charlie Plyben. I am the Oregon Policy Manager for Surfrider Foundation. I also was part of the Rocky Habitat Working Group, and I think this will be my last, potentially my last OPAC meeting, representing non-consumptive recreation.
Thank you, Charlie. Okay, and I will have late attendees introduce themselves, and just for those who joined a little bit late, I'm making a distinction today between panelists and members of the public. Panelists are the lead for the proposals, and agency staff who are here to kind of bounce ideas off of and be the main participants as a part of the workshop, and everyone else is going to be in the public setting. So for folks who want to provide their opinion and perspective right up front, we'll have a public comment opportunity right in just a minute or two. I just want to quickly go through some workshop discussion ground rules. And these are really common sense. I feel like we all, I think, know one another for the most part. So please refrain from providing opinions without a rationale behind those. Where possible, when we're in panel discussions, if our panelists can leave our cameras on when we're talking, that will help us to focus our discussion on the points being made. And then please be respectful, use active listening, and please refrain from any personal attacks. And with that, kind of setting the ground rules, I guess I'll open the floor if anybody else has ground rules that you would throw out or want to include in that. But I think that should cover it for us. Seeing none, I'm going to move on to a public comment opportunity. And the way I'm going to do this is, if you would like to enter a comment on the record, please enter the desire to do so in the chat. I will then kind of track the order of folks who would like to provide a comment, and we'll go from there. So does anybody want to provide public comment in regards to the Fogarty Creek site this morning? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone with a chat indicating that they would like to comment. So I'm going to move us forward, and in recognition of the fact that we're saving up to 30 minutes on our agenda, what I'd like to do is get everyone's permission to include a public comment maybe towards the end of our meeting, as an opportunity for folks who have had to listen to the discussion but not say anything, if you're not a panelist, to provide their opinion and or perspective on the discussion that happened. I'm seeing a thumbs up from Laurel and some heads nodding. So I think I will do that. Please, Moses, if I don't remember, please remind me to do so, kind of as we turn towards adjourning and next steps. Okay, I did want to include a note for us to all remember the fact that as agencies and as representative of the state of Oregon, we do have a responsibility to conduct government-to-government consultation with our tribal nations. And we will, as agencies, I will initiate that process kind of once the proposals have been presented to OPAC, although any tribal member is welcome to comment during our meeting and workshops. But know that as a part of this evaluation process moving forward, we will provide that opportunity to our tribal government nations. And we as agencies would expect to bring back any findings from that exercise into the OPAC process, so that that information can inform a decision in the fall by OPAC. So just a flag that that we will be doing that. It is our responsibility to do so, and we take that very seriously as agencies. So moving on, now is an opportunity for Fran to provide a presentation of her proposal, and really to remind us all, since it's been over a year since we've really dove into the details of the proposals, kind of what the proposal is, and to set the ground for us to have a productive discussion today. So I'm going to stop sharing my machine and my screen, and I will allow Fran to share hers. Do I need to make you a host?
Let me try this. Host disabled participants. Yes, please.
Okay, let me make you. Okay, try now.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Oh, good. Technology at its best. You'd think I would know after a few years of this, but no. Again, thank you all. What I plan to do is go through a series of slides, first to remind us what the proposal was, and also to highlight a few changes within the proposal, but then at the very end to also respond more specifically to the evaluation criteria. So to start out with, we're at Fogarty Creek Marine Conservation Area. Can you see my hand if I move my hand? Oh, good. Okay, so where we are, Depot Bay is down to the bottom left of your screen. So we're on the Central Oregon coast, 12 miles, 15 miles north of Newport. Outside of city limits is Boiler Bay State Park. And this is the Boiler Bay research area that the Menge Lab, OSU and PSCO use for research. And then we have Fogarty Creek State Park. And my proposal is a part of the area within these marks. And the proposal goes from essentially here to the end, and it's in line between the Fishing Rock Headland and the Rabbit Rock Headland, just as a way to easily know the boundaries. So initially, on the right-hand side, this area overlapped with the research area. And I worked with Bruce Menge from OSU, and he suggested to minimize the overlap. He wasn't concerned with the sandy beach area here or the rock, but where this blue line is, this is the line he drew. And I accepted that. So that's the new line. This area in red here is private property, and this other area here is, well, it's just roughly private property. It just is a land area. And the area over here is Boiler Bay research area, and it's named on the map. This is one of the entrances to Fogarty Creek State Park. This is a place name. And I'm willing to stop, Andy. I think we have plenty of time if anybody has questions as I go, if I'm not clear. Okay. So you see how I go down. Here we go. I'm proposing this as a marine conservation area. And I'm willing to discuss if it's better to have it as a continuation of the research area, but I would like additional protections than what the research area provides right now. So I don't know if that would make it easier or not. So I'm talking about a very, very small, highly diverse area. It's along 1 mile of shore. It consists of 86 acres within the polygon. And it's very different than the Boiler Bay area used for research right now. It's got exquisite and extensive kelp, seagrass, and algae beds. Because of that, the Pacific Coast Feeding Group of gray whales actually uses the area. I am standing on the beach. This is a wave hitting the beach. There's a gray whale, and I actually included a link to the video in this presentation. They're using this area because the kelp beds probably, I mean, I'm speculating, but gray whales use stomicids that grow in the kelp beds. And this is not a one-off time. This happens regularly that I see these whales. I haven't seen them for a few years, but when I do see them, they stay in the area and use it. There's a huge amount of bird diversity and seals as well that use the area. And designating this a marine conservation area would support the public's stated interest in increased nature watching opportunities. That was one of the findings of the latest SCORP study about public interest in recreation. So in general, as you know, the purpose of a marine conservation area is to conserve the natural system to the highest degree possible by limiting adverse impacts to habitat and wildlife. And areas that receive this designation would be characterized as a relatively intact system with high ecological value. I would argue right now, because of the lack of use right now of extractive use, it is an intact system with high ecological value, not even relatively. It's a very high use but small area. And you can see the, this is at low tide, so these are living kelps and algae and seagrasses that, that go from the shore all the way out to the rocky ledge that's out here. And this rocky ledge is submerged at high tides. And so it's very shallow in this whole area, but it's very diverse. And here's some seagrasses here. And why I'm emphasizing these kelps and submerged aquatic vegetation is because there's some thought that kelps and algae, seagrasses, not only provide shelter and food and diversity for plants and animals, but they might have some role on a localized basis of helping to mitigate and minimize OAH impacts. And this would be a good study area to test that. So this is a semi-isolated area between headlands. So why I'm thinking this might be an important fact. So the headlands are Fishing Rock and Rabbit Rock and potentially Government Point down here, is that it sort of creates, it's a small, what's called a littoral cell. And it's still open to the ocean, but it's because of the rocky ledges out here, it's sort of an embayment that might, again, create some sort of ability that we could detect in OAH, for example, ocean acidification hypoxia or temperature differential. Don't know that, and I'll get into that later. So one of the questions for research, does kelp SAV help buffer from temperature OAH impacts? It's really easy to inform visitors here. There's only 3 access points. One of them already has this beautiful interpretive sign. I don't think I can zoom in at this level, but it's a beautiful interpretive sign that OPRD and many of the other agencies that you see at the bottom use new Carissa money, I think it was, Laurel can correct me if I'm wrong, to put these signs in, and they're all ripped off up and down the coast. People who had a problem, I guess, took the signs away, but then gave them back. And so we have this beautiful poster about the value of kelp already installed. So this is on one of the 3 access points. The other point is on the opposite side of the Fogarty Creek. And then the 3rd access point is from Highway 101, which is the access now for the Surf Rider Hotel because their stairway got washed away. It's easy to enforce. The full site is visible from just 2 locations. Where my hand is, I'm standing on the south side of Fogarty Creek, the creek itself, looking. This whole area here is one part of the site that's visible from the beach. In this place, I'm standing at Fogarty Creek State Park, Fishing Rock Headland State Park, looking at the other side of the beach. This is Boiler Bay, the end of the, this is the end of the park area, and then this is Rabbit Rock, and you would get to Boiler Bay after that. So from 2 access points, if we really needed to enforce anything, it would be pretty easy to do. Right now, the uses enjoyed are pretty much exclusively non-extractive. There's occasional fishing, there's occasional harvesting of algae, but the majority of people, as shown in a survey for the draft master plan for this area, go to the beach. It's very popular for agate hunting and wildlife watching. And but that's not to say this area doesn't help support the fishery. You'll see this is one of the charter boats out of Depot Bay here. I don't know if you can see that. And here's the rock, one of the rocks. This is one of the rocks in here. The charter boats are way offshore, but they really benefit from the black rockfish, salmon, and other fish that are produced in these rich SAV areas. Sorry about my cursor here. So right now, there's at least, this was as of 2014, way before the pandemic and way before the uses have increased radically about the visitor counts in state parks. There was about, in 2014, there was like 220,000 220,000 visitors already per year here. And I'm sure now it's well over 250,000, probably, more like, I don't know what, I wouldn't want to speculate, but way more than 250,000 visitors use this small area already. There's also a planned campground. I think it's been put off a while, but anything there will add pressure to this area. And there's very spotty mussels, barnacles, limpets, that would be easily depleted. They're very spotty, they're sporadic. And the few times I've seen people take mussels from this beach, four people with 3 coolers between them walking off the beach, it could be easily depleted with any take. I have changed the proposal after listening to last time to Laurel was concerned about taking away uses, fishing, and there was concern from that Jared had heard from higher ups that this was a concern. So my proposal would allow fishing from shore. And this doesn't take away, access to fishing and shell fishing. North of the area, so my proposal would go to the south side of Fishing Rock. The north side of Fishing Rock and the beaches to the north are well used for fishing. Fishing is also in shell fishing in Boiler Bay State Park and Research Area, which is also a lot of it's on private property, but is also allows fishing. So there's adjacent opportunities for fishing and shell fishing. So this is a good site to emphasize conservation values. So there's little extractive use now, so we're not taking anything away from anybody. And in fact, the state parks draft master plan for Fogarty notes a need to capitalize and interpret opportunities around cultural and natural resources. So this proposal would be in keeping with that, their goal there. And there was, and I'll get into this later, but there was a comment about a perception of a marine reserve. I think perceptions of marine reserves are generally positive. 70% of Oregonians overall and 50% of coastal residents support creation of areas that prohibit fishing, harvesting, and other human development. People are concerned. People know that their environment is changing. People prefer to look. And I just think that look and not take is a very positive and sustainable way of enjoying our state parks and natural areas. And in fact, in the Fogarty Creek State Park, in the South Beach and Beverly Beach Management Units final plan draft that was approved in February 2018, Fogarty Creek is not shown as one that is a spot for fishing, but adjacent in tables like this for Boiler Bay State Park and the Fishing Rock to the south and Fishing Rock Headland to the north, fishing does show as uses. So I know State Parks was concerned about taking away fishing, so that's why I'm for changing the proposal to allow it from the shore. But it's really not a common use now. These uses shown in yellow are really the predominant ones that I observe as I go to this beach almost, on a daily basis. Bird watching, nature observation, tide pooling, photography, beach combing, agates mostly. And there's other activities too, but these are the, picnicking and, playing on the shore and kids playing along the along the creek. So again, just want to emphasize that this is not a area used for extractive activities. And the argument could be, well, if it's not used, why do we need to protect? Well, I think that's a precautionary measure. I think precaution is good. Things are changing rapidly. And if we want to sustain things for the future, removing stressors, including human harvest, would be one that I think would be prudent. And the public's interests are changing, and they reflect what I've been saying about interest in preserving the natural world and observing it and enjoying it for that. The latest, as far as I know, SCORP, the State Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan, noted that, and I'll read it, nature-based activities are growing in popularity. Participation in, quote, traditional, end quote, outdoor activities such as fishing and hunting is being replaced by bird watching, photography, and similar activities with lower impacts on natural resources. And it goes on to say that coastal parks, there's tide pooling, whale watching, beachcombing. The visitor feedback about what should be improved in state parks, one of them was, in the top one, I don't know if it was in order of priority, more opportunities for wildlife, viewing wildlife. And then also more interpretive opportunities and education about nature and history. So like this existing sign at Fogarty Creek, this is what people want to see more of. They want to learn about their natural environment. And I think it helps people enjoy and appreciate the natural environment more. And I put in the chat some links to these two articles, very recent. The first, it was an article, a little bit easier to read, in Hakai magazine that talked to Bruce Mengi about his paper. And this just came out in January, Increasing Instability of Rocky Intertidal Meta Ecosystems. So it surprised Bruce, he said, Bruce Mengi, Dr. Mengi, he said, we thought the system was in pretty good shape. As it turns out, we're not sure that's the case anymore. And he says that if they hadn't been collecting this research over all these years, and one of the research sites of 3 up and down the coast was at Boiler Bay, just to the south of this, we wouldn't know it looks good. We wouldn't know how things are changing and how rapidly things are changing. So they talk about what in their research sites where they scrape off a small area and then monitor how it comes back, how it's happening slower and it doesn't recover as quickly, and there's changes of composition. But what's interesting to me is in their control sites, those were also changing, and with bigger and bigger swings in what was living there. And after the sea star wasting disease, they saw a huge surgence of gooseneck, for example. And then after the stars came back, that population of gooseneck barnacles decreased, but it was higher than before the takeover. And also in these control sites, kelp bleaching events and mass mussel die-offs every year at multiple sites. So we're in a little bit of a unknown, but very concerning time for rocky intertidal systems. And they make the point, and this is in the magazine, it's not his quote, but he talked about this. As key species such as mussels, sea stars, and kelp are lost, and as the balance between disturbances and recovery time changes, the ecosystem can shift irreversibly. That's the tipping point. So speculation that we're on a tipping point is there. In the paper, he calls it instability of rocky intertidal meta ecosystem. And these are attributed to the warming events, to current changes, natural events. But the only thing we may be able to do about it is to reduce stressors and to maintain these kelps and SAVs. And here's Dick monitoring at a Cascade Head site. So I just want to point out, I think that's the same picture that he has on his profile page. So this is a very small and I think very valuable area. It can protect the natural biodiversity for enjoyment and research and keep a system intact for increased resiliency. And that's, I think, what we want to do. And it's different than the Boiler Bay Research Reserve just to the south. Boiler Bay has some kelps and seagrasses, but it's not like this. They're not extensive and it's different. So I talked to Dr. Francis Chan. He's agreed with me to install a temperature sensor as a start. He's not convinced that we'll be able to pick up pH or oxygen changes, that go through a kelp bed, but will start with a temperature sensor because he thinks that also would have some really good information. And he also suggested that he and I might work with the Menge lab to do a drone-based georeference survey of the algae resources, again, to document what's there. An MCA designation would not, quote, take anything away from people that are already using it for the most part. In fact, more interpretation would meet Oregon Parks and Recreation Department and visitors' desire to have more information about the natural environment. And this is just a Rocky Shore zonation picture I pulled off the internet, but that's not, there's nothing like that at the site or anything, anywhere. Oh, sorry. So I'd like to specifically address some of the evaluation concerns. So, so I did, as I mentioned, propose to change the MCA proposal to allow fishing from the shore and rocks. I think it's not very productive fishing anyway here, but if that would make this proposal more palatable, I think that would be relatively minimal impact and would be acceptable. There was a concern that this would create a perception of a marine reserve. And I just want to push back on that a little bit, I guess. The shallow, and these are very shallow subtidal areas. And these were specifically allowed to be included in this process, the Rocky Shores process. Anything deeper would be considered during the marine reserve process. Since this really shallow intertidal area is not fished now, it could be closed without any controversy as a biodiversity preservation measure in light of rapid change. And I've seen kayaks launch across the beach. Fishing kayaks, they go out across the surf and past where the boundaries would be, and tend to turn south towards Boiler Bay to fish. But in the summer or fall and summer, this area is becoming a lot more calm than it used to be. It's glassy at times, and it could easily lend itself to fishing in these really shallow areas. And I'd prefer not to have to fight people once they use the area, but just to highlight it as a research study site and an area to look and observe and have an intact small ecosystem. I'm sure, I don't know, I'd have to talk to Dave Fox more, but in tropical reefs, fish are part of what forms the reefs and preserves the reefs. We think of the parrotfish and how they harvest algae off the rocks. And, I don't know if rockfish or other fish that are fished have a role like this, but I just go back to the Aldo Leopold quote. He's talking about land mechanisms, but it's easily sea mechanism. If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota in the course of eons has built something we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. That was Sand County Almanac and other things where he wrote that. Equity of access. So that was a concern, that it was hard to get to other areas. This was an easy area to get to, and they didn't want to deprive people of this. And so that's why I changed that to allow fishing from the shore and rocks. But there's fishing access immediately to the north and south, and invertebrate harvest immediately to the north that it's allowed. So I don't think there's any concerns with access. One of my major failings last time was not to get letters of support for this proposal. And so I went back and I have a letter of support from the Lincoln City and Depot Bay Chambers of Commerce. They were very excited. They want me to write a blog article, and they'll provide educational information in their offices and their visitor kiosks and through their members. They're very concerned about sustainability. They're part of the Oregon Coast Visitors Association that has a sustainability and climate change focus as part of their tourism endeavors. And that was very exciting to hear and to be welcomed like that. And they would distribute whatever materials such as type of etiquette like ODF&W has through their members, like their hotels that could be made available to tourists and residents. They're going to start putting up visitor kiosks. It's a great place to get information out about the birds, about the whales, about the rocky shores. And so that was heartening. I also expect a letter of support from the city of Depot Bay. I think I have this either May 3rd or the next time they meet. So that'll be available at that time I can submit it to OPAC. I have a letter from Lincoln City Audubon and I have that prior letter from the Midcoast Watersheds Council. Don't have a letter, but I had a long discussion with the Clarion Surfrider front desk manager. That's the hotel that sits on part of on top of the bluff right next to Fogarty Creek. She kind of was not concerned. In fact, she was pleased essentially with because she thinks there's, she wants that area to be used sustainably for current and future visitors. And she was concerned about overuse. And she said most of her guests go there and they like the algae hunting, picnicking, playing on the beach. She doesn't see guests that harvest. So that's the
and you just said algae hunting. I think you meant agate hunting.
I'm sorry, I meant agate hunting.
Yeah.
Yeah, she doesn't. She sees people just collecting agates. It's a pretty much well-known place for people to collect agates. Thank you for correcting me. That would have been awful. So, and in the a prior year ago, and I haven't done it since, but I had talked to people at Fogarty Creek, asked them what they liked about the beach, and that was just an informal survey of visitors, and it was mostly for agates and picnicking and letting their kids play in the safety of this creek. So that was consistent. So I'm done, other than to show you, here's the Lincoln City and Depot Bay Chamber of Commerce letter. In that second paragraph, we'd be interested in having you write for our blog about these natural resources, the challenges of ocean acidification and POXA, along with the research being done. We could also help you distribute education information to our visitors through our visitor center kiosks, and we'll also make it available to our chamber members. So that was very positive, and it makes it easy for me now to help with outreach, help save parks, and help others with outreach. I got a nice letter from the Audubon Society of Lincoln City. Here's a prior letter from the Midcoast Watershed Council. The signed one was in the original. And by the time of our OPAC meeting or next week or two, I should have a letter to include from the city of Depot Bay. So that's the end of what I have prepared, and I'll be pleased to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Fran.
Sure.
What I'd like to do now is just ask if there are any clarifying questions from Fran's presentation, because otherwise I think what I'm going to do is take a very short break, 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and enter the meat of our discussion.
See,
and
Jamie and then Dave raising hands.
I do.
Yeah, so let me go with Dave Fox first here.
All right, thanks. Yeah, Fran, thanks for the presentation. Sorry, I'm scanning my notes because I had a couple questions written down.
Sure.
Looks like you've answered some of them in the presentation. Oh, one of them is you stated that there was fishing and invertebrate harvest opportunities to the north. And I understand fishing opportunities in the north. There's a long sandy beach that goes on for a long ways. What invertebrate? What areas were you considering that there were invertebrate opportunities to the north?
Well, there's not a lot, but this fishing rock area, I've seen people harvesting mussels and barnacles from. So my proposal would go to this side of Fishing Rock, and there's no there's no access. It's pretty steep, but this side, people clamber on the rocks, and so it's not very much. And there is at lower tides, there's a few rocky ledges, but I haven't looked at them to know if there's any invertebrates off them. So no, there's not much, but there's not much in this area either. It's very sporadic.
Okay. And the other question I had goes way back toward the beginning of your presentation, talking about the overlap with the current research area at Boiler Bay, and the revised boundaries still has some overlap.
Yeah, he wasn't concerned about that because that was just off the sandy beach and this rock they don't do research on. So this is where he drew the line. I didn't draw it there.
And this is a kind of a fine point of detail, but the north face of that little headland where that line intersects it, would that be considered in the revised boundaries, or would that be part of the current research area? You know what spot I'm talking about?
So you're saying, does this
right where the rock intersects the beach? Yeah, exactly. Because the line's kind of on top of that, so I'm wondering like which that rock face, which
the
one
rock side, I would say would be in, but I don't. It's right now you can't from the beach. It's very difficult, it's steep. It doesn't seem to matter. Sorry, let me just turn down this. I don't know, Dave, you could help me with this, but it's not an accessible area.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know if at low tide, like at really low tides, you get to it, or
not easily, no.
If you're motivated, you can. I've been there. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think that's all the questions I had for clarification. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, and at this time, I think I will allow clarification questions from the public, but when we enter our panel discussion about the considerations after the break, I'm going to hold everyone to public versus panelists just to make sure that we have the time we need for our discussion. So go ahead, Jamie.
Thanks. Fran, you mentioned that the charter fisher people are typically outside this and making this sort of a de facto marine reserve. What input have you gotten from the charter fisher people?
I haven't gotten any input from the charter people. They've been at meetings where I brought this up to the city council, but I haven't gotten any comment from them. This is I don't know if you can see this perspective, but that's a pretty big boat. That's probably a 40-foot boat. So it's quite a distance off. There's nothing that comes even close to the shallow area.
Okay, are there any other clarifying questions for Fran?
I saw Peggy had raised her hand earlier.
Oh.
No, okay.
Nope. Okay. Thank you. All right, well, at this time, then we do have a a short break scheduled. So what I'd like to do is give us, it's 9:22 now. Let's reconvene at 9:35. And
Do you want me to keep this up here, Andy, or?
no, I'm going to go ahead and take the screen back. If we need to have you reshare, then I will do so.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. And so reconvene at 9:35. Thanks, folks. All right, folks, please give me like a thumbs up or turn your video on to let me know if you're back. Okay, I think most of us are back. I don't see her now, but we did have Margaret Corvey join us briefly. Oh, no, I do see her tile. So I wanted to let everyone know that Margaret did join us. And let us re-adjourn. So what I've done here, because there was not any public comment earlier, and we decided we wanted to allow that opportunity again, is I've put a new agenda item in at 11:30 to allow for members of our public to comment after our discussion. And what we are going to transition into now is a discussion about the considerations that were provided in the original evaluation. And this really needs to be focused as a panel discussion between the agency staff and the proposal leads. I am conducting a series of these, so while we have a small group here today for Fogarty Creek, there may be bigger numbers of people, and I'd like them all to be conducted in the same way. So I'm sorry if there's a little bit of formality in that regard, but I want each of these workshops to have kind of the same opportunity for panelists to have that dialogue and discussion. We do have materials that we can reference, both the initial recommendation from the working group and the response from Fran. In this instance, we have the final recommendations, which included a bulleted list of the considerations, some of which I think Fran just addressed as a part of her presentation. So what I'd like us to do now is to move into a discussion of those considerations. And I'd like to, as best we can, have an orderly discussion that kind of works down this list to see whether or not the adjustments Fran has made, whether or not there's still concerns associated with some of the original evaluation guidelines or points that were made. Does that make sense to everyone, to our panelists and Fran? Does that sound like a reasonable path forward? Okay. So what I'd like to do is work on the first bullet first. And this, I may actually take the slides down so that we can have a discussion face to face, so to speak, and or we can pull up the other materials that we have on hand as reference materials. So with the first bullet in respect to the goals, harvest restrictions, and use, let's dive into that one. And as Fran just mentioned during her presentation, she has agreed to make a change to allow fishing from shore in association with the area. And the first thing that brought up to mind is a marine conservation area still the correct designation? To me, it almost sounds consistent with a marine garden designation as an area that would be focused on education, provide an opportunity for research, but a marine garden designation did not restrict fishing, although it did allow for the individual mussel harvest to use as fishing bait. So there's a distinction there that I think we might want to address right up at the front. But maybe I'll let Dave go first to talk a little bit about the modification of the site to allow fishing, and whether or not that gets at one of the drivers of the first points, which was the goals of the site and the use. So Dave, do you have any comments?
Yeah,
Questions?
there's a couple of different aspects to that, and I'll try to separate them if I can. One is that does allowing fishing from shore gets at some of the concern about kind of the equity of access and is there a need, whether or not there's a need to restrict fishing from shore. And so I think it does get at that. Allowing fishing from shore, but then closing fishing in this little small kind of subtidal area does make for a complex regulation and complex kind of enforcement issue. I mean, that might be the second or fourth bullet, I don't know, on your list. There's a lot of overlap between those bullets. And so that would be something that would have to be dealt with. It's going to be confusing, when you say fishing from shore, but if you throw a dinghy in the water and get in it, then you can't fish. It's not like insurmountable, but it's an added complexity. And we try to keep regulations as understandable and as simple as possible. And they're usually pretty complex, and they it's a struggle to try to minimize that complexity. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is what you said about, is it more appropriate in a different category? So there's the three categories: marine garden, research area, and conservation area. And the marine garden is could be a possibility for this, but if you recall, in marine gardens, it allows some opportunities for research, but generally we try to restrict the research to just types of projects that are kind of associated with the fact that it's a marine garden. So if it's a general research on, say, ocean acidification or something like that, that wouldn't necessarily be compatible with a marine garden designation. It would be more compatible with a marine research area designation, because that allows for kind of a broader spectrum of research. It really isn't the only restriction on research permits, say, in a research area is, we review those on a case-by-case basis. And if they're, kind of an outlandish amount of take or something like that, we would, not allow research. But most other research projects, are allowed in a marine research area. So a marine garden would restrict, the types of research. So if anything, it might be, if it was going to be a different, category, it might be slightly better as a marine research area. So that's kind of my initial thoughts on that. And I see Laurel has her hand up, so I'll kind of pass it on to her.
Well, I was just wondering about the classification as a marine research area. I mean, is the purpose of the area for research? That's also what needs to be the case for a marine research area. And I don't see classification as a marine garden as prohibiting research for like ocean acidification. There wouldn't be any necessarily harvest associated with that type of research, would there, Dave?
It depends. I mean, yeah, that's a good. So,
I mean, there would be installation of equipment potentially, but
yeah. So our restriction on research, from a ODF&W standpoint, would be more related to the take of organisms. And so if there was a project that involved some take, then that would be of concern. We'd want to restrict it to just projects that were necessary for the kind of the goals of a marine garden. So I don't know, an ocean acidification research project, you could design ones that don't involve take, you could design ones that do involve take, depending on the goals of the research.
I did have another comment about the suggestion to change it to a marine garden. Usually those are accompanied by a plan or ideas about enhancing recreation opportunities and interpretive opportunities. So I don't know that that was the original. I mean, there were some suggestions in the original proposal about signage, mostly, replacing missing signage for enforcement, for example. But I don't believe that there were suggestions about convening a docent program or volunteers or anything like that that accompanied some of the other proposals. And so we haven't thought about that.
Well, Fran, let me ping pong this back to you. After hearing kind of the nuances of a marine garden and a marine research area, marine conservation area, what is your desire from a proposal standpoint?
So this is my bias. I do not like marine gardens. I think it intensifies use. People come to a marine garden and they're attracted there because it's a marine garden. I think in my case, it would draw unwanted attention to a site that, really I would like to see remain as intact as possible. So I think it would be more appropriate for either a marine conservation area or research reserve. I'm not understanding all the nuances of what you guys are talking about in terms of what's allowed or not allowed for research, but is there a concern just because of the name marine conservation area? Is that what's putting people off? I don't understand why calling something a marine conservation area, if that's the purpose, would be undesirable. I think people want to see conservation. The only other marine conservation area that I know of is the one by Depot Bay in Little Whale, Whale Cove. And that's well supported. And people, you can't get down to it so much, but they have a nice interpretive sign now and a walkway that leads over to it. So, I'm willing to figure out what the problem is calling something a marine conservation area. If that's going to make or break this proposal, we could call it a research reserve. But the problem I see with that is if the research reserve, no matter where that boundary is on the south side, it doesn't allow take of shellfish anyway. But it does allow fishing, even though that's private property right there, and that's hard. That's hard. I mean, people do sneak in, and who knows what's going to happen there. So I think calling something a research reserve, the same thing, but trying to prohibit at least fishing off shore or take off shore might be a little bit problematic. But I just want the goal of the area to be high marine biodiversity and maintain high marine, intertidal rock and subtidal high biodiversity and allow for research. Sorry, I rambled on there.
No, Fran, I don't think that there's any issues or problems with having a target of a marine conservation area, if that's what you want to have. And I think if the proposal is that there are restrictions fishing in the offshore but not from shore, then I think it does alleviate many of the concerns that were listed in the original considerations. It may make things challenging for, as Dave said, to write the rules or to communicate the rules. Laurel, do you have?
I just had a clarifying question. So the proposal, Fran, that you have is to change it from no fishing to just allowing fishing from shore, but that would prohibit fishing in the shallow subtidal essentially, like if somebody was launching a kayak, which is an activity that does occur at that site based on our conversations, that there is, I mean, observed fishing by kayak in that area. So it's a current recreational activity that park staff has told me occurs at that location. So is that true that that would be, I mean, in that section between the intertidal that you could reach by foot, it would just be that section of shallow subtidal that would allow no fishing. Is that accurate?
That would be accurate. And I've never seen people fishing from kayak right there. They launch their kayaks at Fogarty Creek Beach and go out past the rocks where the boundary would be. And in my view, usually turn south towards Boiler Bay. But that's what I've observed. I don't know if the park staff has observed other things, but yes. So the headlands, and that's why I've lined it up with the headlands. So it's easy to say, am I in or am I outside of those boundaries?
Dave, do we have anything like that in other rules?
We don't. We don't have like an area-based rule. Well, I mean, I guess maybe some of the MPAs have different shoreline versus subtidal regulations. So there is some in some of the MPAs.
The north side of Cape Falcon Cove area, is that comparable?
Yeah, that actually, because that actually allows shore fishing. And closes it to boats basically. And then we sometimes in our if we closing, say, fishing to a certain species because it's beginning to reach its annual quota, say a rockfish species, sometimes we'll make that closure to boats only and still allow fishing from shore for that particular species. There's been examples in the past with like copper rockfish in Quebec, things like that, where it's approaching its quota. We'll close it to boats to slow down the fishing, but still allow shore. So it's definitely possible to do. It's not like this impossible thing. It's just, as I said, a complexity. But if that's, we could certainly do it. We could certainly write those rules. It's sometimes a challenge to explain to our commission, though, if you have like a little area like that where there really isn't any known fishing, to say we're going to close it to fishing, it causes a lot of head scratching, and because they're used to regulations that are addressing a harvest issue. But again, it's not impossible. It's just an added challenge.
And we haven't really talked about the concern about the equity of access for other harvest yet. You did suggest that it be open to fishing from shore and that there are limited opportunities for nearby collection. And I would stress the word limited. I've been, in that section on the north side of Fishing Rock. It's a very small rocky intertidal area with very patchy availability of any mussels or seaweed. So if that's a recreational opportunity that we're concerned about, easy access to from the shoreline anywhere between Newport and Lincoln City, this is pretty much the only easy to access non-regulated section of shoreline that has that opportunity for somebody to collect a bucket of seaweed, souvenir harvest level quantities, and or collect shellfish from the shore, because virtually all the accessible shoreline between Newport and Lincoln City is in another category of protection, whether it's a marine reserve, research reserve, marine garden. If you look at the map, there's every other spot that you could hypothetically do those activities is very dangerous to access the shoreline from. It's very steep cliff. So I think from a recreational perspective, that's still a concern of the agency. If that's something that somebody wants to do in the section of shoreline, you'd have to go down to Seal Rock to get anything else comparable. And then to the north, you'd have to go north of the Cascade Head Marine Reserve. And that's, you'd have to go all the way to.
That'd be Oceanside?
Yeah, I mean, if you could find anything like on the north side of like near Nescoin, you have to go north of Pacific City, Cape Lookout, but Cape Lookout's a proposal site. So basically the whole Central Coast. Just putting that out there.
Okay, I just want to flag for everyone that we have switched kind of topics from the site management with respect to goals, harvest, and use. So I want to allow an opportunity to have any other concerns or questions related to the proposal in that regard to come up before we move wholeheartedly into the kind of equity of access topic.
I thought it was sort of a related topic.
It is.
It's harvest related.
It's yeah. It's certainly tied together, but I want to make sure that before we move on, that we do, I think, acknowledge that the proposal modifications that Fran has suggested, I hear that they do go towards the heart of that consideration, the heart of that concern. I don't think it alleviates it entirely because of potential complexity with the designation, wanting to keep it a conservation area but allow fishing from shore.
I guess, Andy, one other thing that is related to the use is that, Fran expressed concern about if it was marine garden, it could attract use. But I think if it's a marine conservation area, it's exactly the same, that people will be attracted to that designation as well. So I think there's kind of really no difference there. We don't have any accessible marine conservation areas yet, so we don't have like a track record of whether or not people are attracted to it. But I think in general, it would be the case. I don't know if that's an issue or not. It might cause, one issue I could see is cause a little bit more enforcement concern or crowd control concern, or it might put a burden on state parks. I'll let state parks address that, with kind of additional use and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think Fran makes a good point. However, in that a marine educational area is really designed to build interpretive capacity, and in some ways that's even more of a draw to a place if there's some official events or interpretive events that happen that will kind of draw people if they're announced, and so I think that there is a slight difference, and I can understand wanting to have the conservation goal in perspective and maybe not have the kind of additional educational draw. So I see Fran's point there. Go ahead, Laurel.
I'm just gonna say it's a very popular state park, and it is, the purpose of the state park is for recreation. So I'm just putting that out there as far as, it wouldn't be attracting you specifically because of the classification for, providing interpretive opportunities in the Rocky Intertidal, but it is a state park designated for recreation uses.
I have personal experience in that regard. It's one of the places I like to visit. Okay, well, let's go ahead and move on and try and talk a little bit more about the equity of access. And the Marine Reserve perception comment that Fran made and the points that she made in her presentation did ring true to me. I think that there is a desire in our public to have more conservation areas, conservation focused areas, and areas for wildlife viewing. So I do see kind of the logic in that point from Fran, but I do want to explore a little bit more the topic of equity of access, and I think as a part of that we could then move also into any concerns about enforcement. Laurel, you still have your hand up.
Oh, I forgot to put my
That's an
hand
old
down.
hand. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, it's an old hand. Old yellow hand.
I could go because I actually did want to talk a little bit more about the Marine Reserve impression.
Okay, go ahead.
And I think in my mind, and it could be just me, you know, because it's an impression, right? So we'll probably all have a different opinion of it. But in my mind, the Marine Reserve impression for a site happens either, you know, one, if the site is, you know, a substantial subtidal area, you know, that's one reason you could have a Marine Reserve impression. And I think, you know, the fact that it's really small and shallow probably, you know, that isn't that big an issue. But the other reason I think for Marine Reserve impression is closure of a subtidal area to fishing. Because I think the big change to people with marine reserves was a closure. It was the first time people really experienced, you know, these spatial closures to fishing. And, you know, most Oregon marine fishing occurs from boats. It's, you know, 85% of the harvest or something from boats. And so that was the big controversy, the big change, you know, what caused people to kind of identify what a marine reserve was, at least to some extent. And so this still has that. So I think there still will be kind of a marine reserve impression. And you know, one of the issues with marine reserve impression, and I think we've explained this in the past, but not maybe recently, is the fact that when marine reserves, process happened, it was highly controversial. It was, you know, I don't know, a 10-year process, very much in the public. And there was kind of this unwritten promise made when that was done that there would be no new marine reserves until the current marine reserves were, you know, fully evaluated. So we've kind of remembered that promise. I think a lot of the folks that were opposed to marine reserves probably remember that promise as well, even though it was unwritten. I'm sure the legislators that were involved remember that promise. So that's something we've been trying to avoid. And that's where I think in the territorial sea plan we were really careful to kind of restrict some of these proposals, or at least consideration of certain aspects of proposals. And the marine reserve evaluation is going on right now. It's being evaluated by a university team. There'll be a report to the legislature later on this year, and then the legislature next year will make some decisions regarding marine reserves. So we're kind of right in the midst of the evaluation. So that's the concern if the public has an impression that we're creating a new marine reserve, you know, when there was a promise not to, and now, you know, maybe to some people we are. I don't know. It's probably it's a much smaller impression because, again, the site's really small, but I think it still has some of that maybe some of that flavor to it. Anyway, again, that's my opinion.
I muted myself, but what I'm showing now, Dave, is the territorial sea boundary relative to the Fogarty Creek proposal. And so my perception is that it would not be perceived as such given the size. And if you look at our other marine protected areas and reserves, that they are really much bigger.
You could show Otter Rock as a comparison site, Andy.
Yep. So here's Otter Rock. This really looks like about, you know, less than a fifth of the size of Otter Rock, which is the smallest of our marine reserves. So I think, Dave, you make good points. But I think the other comment about this site was that it was almost entirely within the -5 meter depth contour. And I don't think that OPAC would have kind kind of allowed sites to even have a potential subtitle kind of extent if they didn't see the value in understanding the connection between the nearshore habitats and the subtitle habitats that were immediately adjacent to those. And I think in this regard, the proposal really does focus in on just the immediate nearshore, very, very shallow subtitle.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, but I think what the point I was trying to get across was the impression wasn't whether or not the site extends there. The impression would be based on the specific regulation, a closure to fishing. I think closure to invertebrate and algae harvest would not be at all controversial, or be lead to that impression. And again, I want to throw it out there. I don't think it'd be a strong issue, but just wanted to kind of leave it on the table just so kind of we're all aware of that.
Well, if the proposal is modified to allow shore-based fishing, then it really wouldn't fit in the same category as a no-take marine reserve. Jared, you have your hand up?
Yeah, this is kind of going back a little bit, but kind of to Fran's point there, I'm just looking at our marine gardens there at Otter Rock. I've been working in this management unit since before it really became established or known, at least. And for better or worse, from my perspective, is it brings in an amazing amount of students and schools that are unregulated and end up unintentionally trampling and honestly harming the ecosystem there. I can tell you from the land management standpoint, it's a nightmare, but that's not what we're here to discuss. When 7 charter buses show up unexpected and things just get trampled and overused. It's an amazing opportunity, but I think I just would like people to think about that. No matter what it's designated, it will bring in more people. It is the nature of the beast from my perspective as a recreational manager.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. So I think the consistent thought as a designation and naming a place in some way does bring additional attention to it. And I don't think there's any way around that. I think that the balance is, do the additional management restrictions that are added help with managing that impact and provide enough of a incentive to move forward with the site to achieve those goals.
All right, can't find the hand raise button here, but one thing to dovetail on what Jared has mentioned that I'm thinking about too is, Oregon has added 1 million people in the last 20 years, and current projections anticipate another 1 million people in the next 20 years. And so, whether we choose one designation over another, with the anticipation of it drawing additional attention, also consider that no matter what we do or don't designate or how we designate it, there's going to be a lot more use regardless. And so in 2040, when there's 5.3 million people in Oregon, how do we want those people using it? How do we want the population using it? What level of use do we want, and how do we want to regulate that? So just something to think about in the background at the same time.
Yeah, thank you, Moses. That does really go to one of Fran's points, which is, if we do create a designation here prior to people having an additional attachment to uses at a site, then you're not taking something away. You're establishing through the precautionary principle, in basically additional management measures to help control that.
Andy, I just have to say something about that, is that the information that we have right now, I don't think is accurate enough. I mean, adequate enough to say that we that there aren't those uses. There hasn't been a detailed study of the uses of the shoreline there. I appreciate that Fran goes there a lot, but the master plan, didn't involve a shoreline study at the site. The rocky shore areas weren't included in the 2002 ocean shore recreation use study. All the information we have right now is anecdotal. So to say that there's no or limited of XYZ activity, recreational activity at the site is all based on anecdotal evidence. And so to say that we're not taking something away from users that may or may not be doing that, I just don't think we know that. And maybe Jared can speak up about that, but the information that we have about use of the site is, as far as I know, purely anecdotal. There hasn't been a survey at Fogarty Creek specifically. There have been surveys in the management unit to support the master planning, including at Beverly Beach for overnight users and day users and other nearby parks. But to say that there isn't that activity of somebody going out, collecting their gallon bucket of seaweed or collecting a few mussels, I just don't know that we can say that. I mean, I can't say that with a straight face. So to say we're not taking it away, I just don't think we know for sure, except for some anecdotal evidence from folks that love the park, as I do too.
Thank you, Laurel. And I think it's good to be reminded of that fact. Can we turn back to the topic of equity of access to harvest? I think that was, another one of these situations where I think we really maybe have anecdotal evidence that this is one of the few places in the Central Coast area that people would have an opportunity for either seaweed collection or intertidal harvest.
Well, I don't think it's anecdotal. I think you can look at, it's anecdotal as to whether or not we have information about recreational use patterns. But if you look at the shoreline you'd have to go to the south to Seal Rock to get a easily accessible rock intertidal area. And then to the north, quite a ways, maybe to Cape Lookout to find an easily accessible rock intertidal area to do those recreational activities. That's pretty much most of the Central Coast. That is either hard to access because of steep cliffs and or is in another protective category, either a marine reserve, because there's 2 marine reserves, and there's also multiple different protections in the rest of the rock intertidal along there that is accessible. I don't know, you can pull up a map, Andy, and show you've got all those layers.
Yeah, let me turn these on here.
Or you can do a simple scroll up from Seal Rock. As far as I know, Seal Rock is the closest next spot that you could go.
What about in Taft, Laurel, the rocks offshore?
If you consider that a substantial rock intertidal area, I suppose.
Also, to be completely accurate on the harvest opportunities, Laurel's correct in saying, you couldn't get algae at all those sites, but in our research, in many of our research areas, you're still allowed harvest, recreational harvest of certain species, mussels being one of them. So theoretically, you go down into Whaler Bay and harvest mussels. I don't know that anyone really does that, but it's allowed.
Right, so the opportunity is there. It's certainly not as easy of an access.
I would certainly, put that into the category of difficult to access locations. I've scampered down that trail. It's not easy.
Jared has his hand up.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry, I'm staring at the map here.
No, you're good. I'm just thinking about, we keep talking about people going to Boiler Bay, and technically people are breaking rules to go over the fence to go out and fish there. We're here to protect the safety of the public, And what we're doing is we're encouraging people to do unsafe activities, putting them in areas where people get washed off the rocks a yearly basis. And so I couldn't live with myself if I didn't bring that up, that we're asking people to violate a rule to go fishing at some of these areas. And so you cannot harvest stuff without violating another rule at a lot of these areas or damage the part of that ecosystem there. And it is not a place for tourists. Some of the locals understand the dynamics there, but we're asking these Oregonians and visitors from other states to go do it here where the chances of you getting injured are higher. And again, this is my perspective from the safety aspect.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Fran.
So I live in Depot Bay, and there's rocky shores in front of Depot Bay, and people fish from the rocks there. And there is in that small scramble beach at the base of North Point there's relatively at low tide, a pretty extensive intertidal with algae. I've never seen people harvesting there, but it potentially could be done. But people do fish off the rocky shoreline of Depot Bay and of North Point.
Hey, Fran, have you seen anyone like harvesting mussels and kind of in that rocky area in front of Depot Bay?
No, but I don't observe that all that frequently. But I don't know. I'm sure there are, mussels. I haven't seen any.
I mean, there's lots of mussels on those rocks. A lot of it's pretty steep. I mean, it'd be pretty dangerous.
I would not put that in the easy to access category. That shoreline is very dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, there's a path down to the beach there. It's not part of a state park, though.
I was talking about more of that rocky kind of frontage, right, where the highway goes by, right in the main part of Depot Bay. There's, where the little seawall.
Yeah, I don't see people harvesting mussels. I do see people fishing there a lot.
And is it technically not allowed to jump over that seawall? And
no, it's caution, stay back, high waves.
Yeah. Okay.
But I do want to clarify the rule that people break when they go down into the Boiler Bay Research Reserve, because I guess I was not familiar with that. Jared, which rule is that, or Laurel?
I think he's talking about people that go over the fence to go fishing off the rocks at Boiler Bay. I don't think Jared was talking about the folks that scramble down that unofficial trail from that little highway parking lot.
If you can call it a parking lot.
A pull off. I said
Yeah.
unofficial. It's not a maintained trail, as far as I know. Jared, no.
No, it's a social trail. Well, from the research that goes on, I am talking about it at within the Boiler Bay State Park property, the more developed area there.
Oh, gotcha. When they hop over the fence.
Yes.
Like on the south facing side.
The whole west side of that.
The whole west.
Yes, they cut the fence, which allows kids through. And we just had black oyster catchers nesting there last year. It's just an ongoing issue where people that see people on the other side of the fence will go, but it's there to protect the public. But yet we have it as, and this is an internal thing too, as a spot to fish, as Fran pointed out, apparently on our website or whatnot. But I'm referring to the actual state park where there's fence lines where we manage it for the recreationists.
Got it. Thank you. So it sounds to me like, I guess there's what I would call still uncertainty with equity of access associated if this proposal were to go through. I guess that, you know, from a recreational standpoint, parks still has concerns about access to nearby opportunities that are as easily accessible. And I guess some of that goes then to the stakeholder support for a site in the same area. And, you know, Fran did mention letters of support for the site from several of the organizations. I think it would be harder to gauge a general public interest and perspective on whether or not there's any kind of statewide support, or, you know, I'm sure there would be some differences of opinion. But I do want to recognize Fran's additional outreach and engagement with the local communities through the Chamber of Commerce and through the other organizations on the Mid-Coast. And that was one of the other considerations that we included in our recommendation of the site. So Fran, thank you for doing additional outreach. I wanted to ask our panelists, you know, their thoughts about additional outreach engagement that might be necessary to help determine concerns about equity of access in this area. Laurel?
Well, before you said that, I was just going to say that you know, if something like this were to go through, the next opportunity that we would have would be at the OPAC meeting, and I just don't know that that gets the general, you know, the general recreating public, and then we would have to do rulemaking because this rule would be different than the rules that we currently have, probably. But at that point, it would be designated. Like, it's not like that input when we did the rulemaking would change the rules, so I don't think that's really a great opportunity for feedback from the public. So, I mean, I think it's a great idea to have that discussion about potential other opportunities, but to somehow get feedback from the users of the park and that general section of the coast, recreational users. I don't know if folks have ideas about how that might happen. Jared or Guy?
Blake, you have your hand up. Maybe I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I mean, off the top of my head, we could, you know, do some sort of questionnaire to park visitors to see how they're using it, or we could hold, you know, some sort of informational meeting out at the site that would get at the least locals who use it probably on a you know, weekly, daily occurrence as opposed to tourists. So that might get both of those things might get a better idea of actual use. Those are what I was thinking. But I'm also, you know, I kind of lean towards engaging with the public, you know, as far as, you know, having a meeting, having some sort of comment period. So I think that would just benefit us in general.
Yeah, thank you, Blake. And what I want to say is that, you know, OPAC is truly the venue for public comment on this site. In the past, it was the venue that, you know, was used to make the recommendation on marine reserves and protected areas. So, you know, to me, it's consistent to allow public comment at our OPAC meetings, both associated with the meeting where the proposals are presented, as well as the meeting following where OPAC will be asked to make a decision on these sites. So I do think those are good ideas, Blake, to potentially get some additional ground truthing from folks in the local community who are using the site. But I do think OPAC is the correct venue, and that is where we would, as public advisors to the state, that's where we would ask for public comment on this proposal to be provided. Dave, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just to continue with kind of outreach possibilities. I think it would be good to get out, do outreach to like Depot Bay charter industry. And again, I mean, Fran pointed out very accurately that, the 45-foot charter boats are not going to go into that site. I mean, that would be, they basically run aground, I mean, or beach their boat. So they're not going to bring their, $800,000 boat into that site. But I think it would still be good to have outreach to say, this is going on. There will be a fishing closure, but look, here's the site boundaries, just to make them aware and see what feedback they give. I suspect there wouldn't be much of a concern, but who knows? And I think that outreach should probably happen. The other being maybe the like the port of Depot Bay, because I think they do serve recreational boaters that launch at the launch ramp there, so while the big charter boats aren't going to be able to get to the site, it is possible to get a small boat into there on a calm day, like a 16-foot Boston whaler or like a little Zodiac, rigid hull inflatable type boat or something like that. It's possible. And again, I don't think, like Fran said, probably hasn't observed that actually happening, but just to get feedback from them. And then I don't know if, like was pointed out, there's a lot of kayak use there. I don't know if there's a particular group or club or society or something or some contact points for kind of the kayak users, or maybe some tour guides, or I don't know. It would be good to have input from that user group as well. I don't want to keep throwing them out there because I don't want to list like 100 things. I mean, but those three seem to be kind of big in my mind.
Are there any other comments or thoughts about stakeholder engagement? Okay.
Andy, sorry,
go ahead, Laurel. Yep.
I would say as part of that communication, I think it's important to set the sort of regional context of this, is that this would, the impacts of doing something like this for that regional opportunity for that type of recreation. So I think if somebody just looks at the site by itself, it's different than looking at it in the context of the Central Coast and the recreational opportunities. So I think like painting that picture is important when that outreach is done, because folks might not, until you look at a map and you're like, oh, well, there's really no other places to do that. If somebody did want to do those recreational activities, I think it just isn't clearly, it's not obvious.
I would also say how we're evaluating that feedback in terms of if we're receiving, information that says a small amount of people use that site for that particular purpose, that could demonstrate the lack of need. From a recreational standpoint, I would also say that the potential to have an adverse effect to the environment would be reduced as well. So are we over-regulating an activity that doesn't need to be regulated, would be the concern there.
Okay. I realized that we bounced around off of the bullet I had about concerns with enforcement. We didn't cover that in the second bullet. So I just wanted to see if there was any comment or question about, I guess, enforcement of the site if it were to move forward. Fran did point out in her presentation visibility from 2 vantage points. You can get, a good view of the entire site. Dave, looks like you have your hand up, and then Laurel.
Yeah, it's kind of it's related to enforcement. It's still the it's the fact that the site still does overlap, with parts of the existing research area. So and I think that would have to be taken care of with, you know, if the site did get adopted, we would probably have to change the boundary of the Boiler Bay research area as well to make the boundaries not overlap. But just wanted to point that out, because otherwise it would start being questionable. What if someone's doing something in that overlap area? You know, that gets confusing. Even though it's small, it still exists. So I think we probably would just handle that through, you know, adopting the, you know, this side, then changing the boundary of the other side.
Okay, and I'm going to pull that up for folks so that we can all see that together again. So this is approximately the line that Fran referenced earlier in conversations with Bruce Mengi. Here's the overlap that we have between the research area now and a potential new site. So Dave, what I heard you suggesting is that if we were to move forward with a designation in this area, that we should reconcile by readjusting the boundary here so that they are coincident with each other and not overlapping.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Laurel, go ahead.
I agree with Dave on that point. I also just wanted to point out that one of the vantage points was from the beach. So somebody would, you know, need to come down from the parking lot and walk on the beach to see that one section that Fran showed. Not that that's not possible, but that just, you know, takes time to go out there to do that. And I don't think, you know, as far as OSP, I don't know if they are doing that kind of thing. And then the fishing rock one is, you know, you have to park and walk to the end of the little trail there to get out there. It's not immediate from like a pull off from the highway, for example. It's not super quick. The other point about enforcement is, especially with two boundaries that sort of butt up against each other, signage and or communicating those boundaries on site will be difficult. It's difficult for other sites, you know. Signage would have to, I mean, you can't really put signage out there on the beach. We try for certain other management areas and it's very challenging, but in that environment, that would be, you know, pretty much virtually impossible. So you would have to rely on signage like at the cluster board at the beach access points, and communicating the boundaries is already tricky at that site with, you know, the creek, I think, is the boundary on the north side. I'm just communicating that signage and communicating the boundaries and the regulations will be challenging at this site, the way it's organized right now.
Yeah, and I think the best way, you know, to have those boundaries on, you know, where they intersect there, is to make sure that you know, the boundary ends where it's also not accessible. So then it's easier to communicate the boundary because you don't even, you know, it's basically it ends at the end of the walkable beach, you know, accessible beach. So just have to, you know, be careful for that boundary. I think that would be helpful, you know, if they can't go there, if a person can't go, you know, it's kind of like the north boundary of the Otter Rock Marine Garden. It's basically where you can't go. You know, you physically can't go beyond it, and that makes it easier.
Yeah, and you can get to that little like bottom, depending on the tide and what the rocks are doing that particular year during the season. Yeah. Like that little stretch right against that cliff. There's some cliff nesting birds there.
And that's why you might maybe put the boundary at the tip of that little headland rather than make it come to the beach. I'm calling it a headland. I mean the little protrusion of rock there.
You mean here?
Yeah. I mean, this is like, we're talking about very minor adjustment. Something that make it so it's beyond where anyone could potentially access even at the lowest tide. So that anytime anyone's on the Fogarty Creek beach, no matter how, unless they're a mountain climber or something, within reason, the only places they get access from the beach would be places that are within the marine conservation area, and not have a little tiny, 100-foot stretch where they would cross the boundary.
Okay. Fran, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's really smart. That would make sense.
Jared's had his hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
When it comes to enforcement, I would just highly encourage to bring in Oregon State Police to have their comment, and whomever does the enforcement through Fish and Wildlife. I don't know if Dave's representing them, but I have not ever seen any enforcement at the Marine Gardens of Outer Rock, and we're just going to water down what we already have if we're not enforcing things, but the people that do the enforcing aren't even going to be there to enforce it. I don't know if that makes sense. Enforcement or lack thereof is not an excuse not to protect something, but before we go saying we're going to enforce rules, we need to make sure that somebody's able to. And I have not seen it in this area from my perspective.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point that we need to, excuse me, have OSP input on these sorts of things. And, we were pretty careful in the whole, marine reserves process to bring OSP in, since they're the primary enforcer for harvest regulations anyway. Realistically, at these at existing marine gardens, research areas along the coast, the enforcement that, at least to my knowledge, the enforcement that OSP does is based on people calling in, like seeing illegal activity, calling state police, and then state police responding. I don't think they do like a proactive patrol type enforcement at any of these sites. And I think, Jared, that's pretty consistent with what you observe as well. So it's really, I don't think we're gonna, in the designation of sites, get OSP to, do some sort of active patrolling, at least on a regular basis, without some increased funding. We did that with Marine Reserves because we increased our funding. We actually, the Marine Reserves program, pays into the state police budget for Marine Reserves enforcement, and they do some active patrolling of Marine Reserves, as well as respond to specific citizen call-in complaints.
And I would say in multiple communications with OSP enforcement officers about those Marine Reserve designations, that it needs, for them to do enforcement of any regularity, it needs to be in a location where they can quickly access it from a road or highway, hop out, use their binoculars. For something like this, I would be surprised if they would get out, walk the trail, go out to the beach, unless it was in a responsive way. It wouldn't be a patrol type of situation, based on those communications that we've had about the Marine Reserves needing a place where they can, check it quickly.
Yeah, most of their enforcement is through standing on, pull-offs from the highway or whatever, where they get an overlook with binoculars. And they're mostly looking for boats, right? They're looking for boats fishing out in the water, so they need to have those observation points, and then they do some enforcement. They have a boat as well, an OSP enforcement boat, and they do some enforcement of Marine Reserves with the boat as well.
For boat enforcement at the site, there are pullouts along the highway that you could see boats in the water, or from the surf rider. If you're looking in the water, you wouldn't be able to see, all the beach or rocky intertidal, but for, boats, you could see that from either the surf rider motel or from the highway.
Laurel, you came off mute, looks like.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, if the primary boat type that's gonna be doing fishing in here is like kayaking, that's gonna be, if there's a kayak in there, are they fish, can you see their fishing pole? I don't know. I just think this will be a challenging enforcement site for multiple reasons, signage and otherwise. And I don't know that we've resolved the issue of the equity of access from OPRD's perspective. I think that this is one of the only places on the entire Central Coast where you can do those recreational activities, whether they happen or don't happen. It is an opportunity that exists currently that would be removed with this being a designated site. So I just had to say that.
I hear you loud and clear, Laurel. Go ahead, Fran.
I'm sorry, can I respond to that? I think, like I said, that recreational interests are changing. And I don't think the historic uses of take, having access to take things, are really what the public from OPRD's own research has shown. That's not really the interest anymore, as I quoted earlier from the most recent SCORP. Non-consumptive uses are becoming more and more and more popular versus the consumptive uses. So again, I mean, it's a different perception. I just don't think of this as denying people anything. Yes, there may be some people that really like to harvest mussels or barnacles or kelp, but the great majority do not. And I think they like to see the diversity, and they like to see a conservation area. And that is a recreational use. It's just not a use we're focused on right now. So I'm just pushing back a little bit because it makes me sad that it's so hard to protect resources for their own value. And I think most people would say they would prefer that an area be left to be for the current and future generations. And so I'm just pushing back a little bit, because the equity of access is having access to a diverse world, to a conserved world, to one that has the best chance of being intact as we're facing the huge challenges of climate change. And people were devastated by the loss of sea stars. They don't need to harvest sea stars to want them to be there. So I'm sorry, I'm giving yet another lecture, but that's my perspective. And it just makes me upset to think that this equity of access, because there's no other places like this, could go away just because we need to provide places for people to take things.
Fran, I would agree with you in a lot of those points, but it's that the rest of the shoreline is protected on the Central Coast in any place that somebody can access. So we have, it's just, this is the last remaining place, except for Seal Rock, that has that opportunity. I think there is conservation on the Central Oregon coast and all the rest of the Rocky Intertidal areas. So I don't know, it's a tough one, because I agree that the recreation is changing, but there is still quite a bit of interest in recreational harvest of seaweed, for example. There's increasing interest, in fact, for that recreational activity. And very few places to do that.
I think this kind of is in. It's a little bit of a broader view, but considering the highly diverse and functioning intertidal environment, it seems to be pretty close to an ideal circumstance in regards to having a natural balance between conservation and recreation without installing additional restrictions. So I think it would be different if we saw a degradation of the site over time and had some points to document those concerns. But having small recreational use in a particular area usually doesn't justify the concern for excluding it. So I think it ties in a little bit to the goals as well as the equitability of access. But even looking at some of the park plans for this area of a 25% reduction in the parking area will further allow for hopefully the site to be able to self-manage almost in a way, just controlling the population numbers. So just some things to be thinking about, I think, of how we want to achieve the conservation goals, but again with still maintaining a person's connection to the site.
And again, as far as like the algae harvest goes, that is a souvenir, the only allowance, we're not permitting large quantities. There's no commercial allowance. It is small quantities. Like the limit is 1 gallon bucket. It's a very small amount when you consider kelps or seaweeds. Like how many kelps fit in a 1 gallon bucket? Like not very many. I mean,
It's
like
not
even
what's
one,
true. It's not
even
true
one
though.
piece.
People
Well,
haul off garbage bags and garbage bags and garbage bags full of kelp
well,
from
that
that
is,
site.
well, then that is an illegal activity that is already prohibited in rural France. So if that is happening, then that is outside. I mean, that doing this is not going to change that activity. That activity is already an illegal activity that needs enforcement action if it's happening. If it's in the Ocean Shore State Recreation Area. If it's outside the Ocean Shore State Recreation Area, then that's under DSL jurisdiction, and that would have to be Blake to speak to that.
That would be in the subtitle. Either, there's no kelp growing above the Ocean Shore Recreation Area that I'm aware of. So it would all be, accessing the resource in the subtitle. And my guess at this site, that would be extremely challenging to get to the extreme low water tidal datums. So,
and I think DSL has even spoken to that they're not, going to change the rules for that. It already, they're already not allowing commercial harvest, but the plan isn't to change the statutory allowance for subtidal kelp. So I don't know if Blake wants to speak to any conflicts there.
I mean, I don't really have anything to add, but thank you.
So just to clarify, though, we're talking about in algae harvest, we're talking about both intertidal and subtidal, not exclusively subtidal, right? Because there's a lot of intertidal algae that could be harvested and are desirable to harvest.
Yeah, but I mean, Andrea brought up the point that there's that, the statute that allows a certain amount of personal harvest of kelp. And I believe that is not changing, or does anybody remember the details of those conversations that we had that could potentially be an issue?
We should probably clarify that, because I have just a vague recollection that our final conversations were that DSL determined that they could limit recreational harvest.
they can, because they have done so in the marine reserves.
Yeah, and we could use Division 88 rulemaking to, highlight specific areas. Typically, when we're talking about restricting uses, DSL, we want to be limited in scope and be, limited in what those restrictions are. Those are typically our guiding. So we don't like to restrict, an entire use across an entire either waterway or across the whole state. So we would want to identify it, like here, Fogarty Creek, where this activity would be specifically limited. That said, I have not been, a part of those conversations with Andrea. And as you know, Andrea, unfortunately, has left us for Metro. I was not privy to any discussions at DSL where we were contemplating changing those rec rules. But if we did, it would likely be under Division 88. It's a more straightforward process for us to take on. And just one last thing to add, sorry. Anyone in the public can request a restriction or closure through Division 88 rules. Does not have to be instituted by the department. A member of the public can request rulemaking change through Division 88. So.
Thank you, Blake.
Can I ask Fran a clarifying question about the activities that she's observed? Was that from, I mean, somebody walking, I'm assuming it wasn't somebody, were they in waders? Were they in a kayak? Like, were they in the subtitle, or were they harvesting large quantities from the shore, like dried up kelp on the shoreline for like garden purposes, or just what, could you explain the type of activity you've observed?
Yeah, it was the wide-bladed, I think it's called wakame. And people are coming in with large families. And each one takes off bags and bags of specifically culling certain algae, which I have a real problem of. So they're removing quantities in the intertidal zone or sub-intertidal, but lower, when it's lower tides, going out onto the rocks and specifically cutting large quantities. And then my concern is it gets posted on Facebook, and then more and more and more people come. So it's an organized thing. It's not just people saying, oh, I'd like to have, some kelp. And with those large quantities being removed from the beach, you wonder if it's for commercial sale, even though they don't have commercial permits. And I think the time to act is before things get on that social media posting, and there's more and more and more use. It's not just it's not somebody coming. It's the same people coming over and over and over.
So as I said, that it sounds like, based on what you've described, that is an activity that's outside the allowance that's in our ocean shore rules for collection of souvenir amounts of intertidal seaweeds, which is limited to 1 gallon per person. So if they're taking bags full, that is clearly above the allowance in rule, which, is an interpretation of the word souvenir in statute. So those are not souvenir quantities that those people are collecting. So this designation wouldn't, is not necessary to prohibit that activity since it's already prohibited. I'll just say that again.
I think though, if there's no harvest, it's so much easier. It says no harvest. So we're not going to be parsing whether it's, 1 gallon or if it's more. It just makes it much more easy to be clear about what the rules are. So, sorry.
I really think it'd be important to re-engage with the public. I've just seen a huge change where folks violating rules, fishing in areas they can't, are telling me, how am I supposed to feed my family? And so while I agree with the conservation, I don't know that the surveys are adequate with the current changes that have occurred in the last couple of years, honestly, just from what I've seen out in the field.
Jared, I think in many ways you've hit the nail on the head. I would love a lot more data to be able to make, a clear decision in this regard. And I think that's one of the things that's handicapped us a little in understanding the policy choices and the management need that, we are hearing, from our stakeholders about in some instances, but maybe we're not hearing in others. And that does drive to the heart of the issue is, how do we as a community make these decisions? And to me, the balance that's in front of us, I think, our job will be to communicate to the Ocean Policy Advisory Council that there are still some concerns about equity of access to this site that state parks has. At the end of the day, there will be a policy call by the Ocean Policy Advisory Council to to state whether or not they believe that taking a precautionary approach to any of these sites that we're going to be considering is the right approach. And that is the arena where that conversation will be had, and that at the end of this specific process, they will be the decision-making body as to that. So I don't know that today we as a community are going to resolve this issue. What I have promised is to relay that this issue may still be a concern, is still a concern. I've heard from Laurel directly and state parks in general. But I also understand Fran's perspective, and the OPAC process has been designed to allow that discussion to occur in OPAC as the public venue. Go ahead, Laurel. You have your hand up.
I'm just clarifying that those aren't my personal opinions. Those are opinions that I got from upper level management that I'm conveying on behalf of the agency. So
thank you. I
just
didn't
to
mean
clarify,
to.
it's not Laurel's opinion. Thanks.
Thank you. I did not mean to attribute that to you. I did see or get a question in the chat, which is why I put it a response that we didn't have any public comment early on prior to our discussion, but we did decide as a group to allow that to occur following our discussion. So there will still be an opportunity. I want to make sure though that we have exhausted all of these topics to the degree that we can and that we want to. In my view, I think we're actually getting pretty close to that. I'm hearing, that I could try and do a wrap up for everyone, although I'm not sure that I would get it all right because of the nuances involved in some of the conversations. But I did hear that, with a willingness to change and allow fishing from shore, that could alleviate some of the concerns associated with restricting fishing at the site, which is a use that's currently observed. But that, as Fran mentioned, the goal of marine conservation in her perspective was to maintain the biodiversity and protect the algal community there, with a long-term goal of being able to understand whether or not the diversity of algae species in the area and the presence of that algae species in the area can help to address climate resilience concerns that may be associated with ocean acidification or hypoxia. It was recognized that this is a high-use site, and any designation at the site may draw increasing numbers of people there, but the preference from Fran was to maintain either a marine conservation area or potentially to extend the research area. I believe that's a decision that's up to Fran as to how she would like to proceed in that regard. Moving down to the next bullet, there were observations about enforcement, even though there are a couple of reasonably easy access for observations in communications with state police. It's observed that they don't generally like to get out and walk distances from their cars to conduct observations or surveillance of an area. So even though walking to the beach and looking north, you can see everything, and from Fishing Rock, you can see everything to the south. There's still a little bit of a barrier potentially in that enforcement happening, unless somebody actually calls and issues an alert that an activity is happening that's outside of the rules or what's allowed. There is still an issue or a consideration about equity of access to harvest, this being one of the few places in the Central Coast where there's relatively easy, at least in terms of being able to walk out to the site and access the site, access to be able to harvest small amounts of marine vegetation and or invertebrates. And in terms of the perception about the area being a marine reserve, we did have a discussion about many of those concerns being alleviated because the site is so small and it's kept to such a small, shallow subtidal area. But the fact that it would limit fishing from a boat is part of what the concerns from our ocean user community was in terms of limiting their fishing access. Conversations about the fact that there are kayak fishermen that go out of the site, although anecdotal evidence is that they do not currently use the area that would be included in the marine conservation area as a target area for fishing. We did recognize the additional stakeholder engagement that Fran conducted with letters of support from local chambers of commerce. We did talk about additional needs for outreach, potentially at the Port of Depot Bay or with the charter boat community out of Depot Bay. And to make it clear when we talk about this site that we, from a regional perspective, put it into context. But also that really OPAC is the venue that we would want to hear from our public about implementing the site, and that in the past OPAC has been that public forum that was used to make decisions about marine protected areas and marine reserves. So that really is the right venue for doing so. Lastly, I think we had some recommendations for the site boundary change, how to handle issues associated with the overlap between any proposal here at Fogarty Creek and the Boiler Bay Marine Research Area, reconciling those so that it's not confusing either for enforcement or for people who are using the site. That's important. And I think, Fran, the onus will be on you to communicate exactly how you would propose to resolve or how you would propose to move forward in that regard in terms of the consideration. Okay. I'll open the floor to our panelists to see if you have umbrage with anything I just stated as a part of the wrap up for the discussion, or want to provide any other observations from the discussion. Dave.
Just a minor thing on kind of the enforcement issue concerns. It'd be really good to get some input from OSP, as was suggested by others as well. And that doesn't necessarily have to be in a giant public meeting. You could just call them and ask for input, So that would be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I was actually contacted by OSP very recently asking about the other boundary of the territorial sea and whether or not the state had a set of coordinates that was used for enforcement there. So I need to get back to them on that inquiry, and I think it would be an opportune time to bring the issue of any of these proposals and enforcement in front of them to get their comment on that. So I will commit to doing that and leading that effort so that OPAC can have the benefit of input from OSP. Laurel.
I just had a thought about trying to engage the users of the park. When we post, when we do a permit for shoreline protected structures, for example, we have to post at the site on site. And I wonder whether when we know a date for the OPAC meeting or if there's any sort of venue for collecting input specific to site-specific proposals, whether posting something at the location would be helpful to give people a notice that that is an opportunity for public engagement. We can post it like at the restroom or at the beach, the cluster board at a time in advance of that opportunity for public comment, whether it's written or virtual or in person. I think that, as long as it was ahead of time to get users that might not be, coming weekly or daily, because I'm sure, it wouldn't capture the tourists that come once a year, but it might capture the folks that might go there more regularly, either, once a week or daily or weekly or monthly. if we posted it in advance of some sort of opportunity for public feedback for those park visitors that are hard to reach otherwise.
Laura, I think that would be a great idea, and I think it would apply to any of these sites that are under further consideration or evaluation. So maybe I could commit to working with you and your park staff if we make a flyer about public comment for these. I could have you work with your staff to put a sign up on the boards, since I'm not regularly out there.
Oh yeah, we could definitely post it. Figuring out what it should say exactly would be, might
Yep.
be sites. It might be helpful if it was site specific.
Sure.
We could make a template for them.
Mhm.
I don't know if Jared came off mute, so he might have an idea.
I just would say there's a lot of different user groups there from different ethnicities. So if it's just in English, we're not gonna capture the user groups. And I want to thank, as much as I love this conversation and everything, I do want to thank you guys for everything you're doing, and Fran for bringing these up, because these are the discussions that help our world last for the long haul in all aspects. And so this is, I'll shut up. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Jared. Are there any other, Fran, do you have any other thoughts that you'd like to communicate to the panelists or in regard to your proposal?
No, I like that idea. We're also a posting on the beach, I think, or on the entry boards. I think that's sort of a random sampling of people. That would be good. I think that would be really good.
Well, that's all we have so far for all the information that we have too, is the anecdotal, like, do people fish or do they not fish? I mean, it depends on, what you go out there and see. I have seen people fishing from kayak at that location in the few times that I've been there. I saw somebody. So, I mean, it would be better than nothing as far as getting feedback from folks.
And keep in mind that we have the time period between now and when OPAC meets later in the year to get information from our public. So the OPAC meeting that's coming up, hopefully I can get one in June scheduled where we have enough OPAC members to be there. But there will be time between then and when OPAC makes a decision to be able to solicit that public comment. So it's not a short window, it's a slightly longer window. So I think we do have some room to make progress in that regard. Okay, I'll do one more check to make sure that nobody has their hand up or wants to comment on any of the items that we've discussed already. And then I will pull up my slides again. And we have added this public comment opportunity. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, but I feel like we should go ahead and move to public comment. So please, if you have public comment, go ahead and do so now. So enter your desire to do that in the chat, and then I'll call on you. Okay, Charlie Plyman.
Thanks, everyone. Charlie Plyman, Oregon Policy Manager for Surfrider. Reminder for the record. And excellent presentation, Fran. Thanks so much for that. That was really great. As the chair of this working group that kind of wrestled through a lot of the early part of the evaluation, I thought you did a really nice job kind of reviewing all of that work, and there's been a lot of work gone into this. And I just really appreciate that. This is kind of a big missing link, I feel like, and part of the rocky habitat process that we set forward. This specific and long sort of evaluatory dialogue, I think, is really important, and the opportunity, I think, and some time even for the individual proposing to sit on that, and whether that's doing the outreach, which you've done a great job with, or whether that's wrestling through all the paperwork. I think you did a really nice job, so I appreciate that, Fran. And I just want to call as a point of process that for future proposals and future proposal processes that we do give it this time to have this kind of back and forth. I wish there were other OPAC members, and I thank the other OPAC members that are here because this is a really important dialogue for making any future decisions about this site. A lot of the discussion I heard here was like the same things, the same sort of things we were wrestling with when we were deciding what type of designations to allow the public to put forward. And I think this is very clearly a conservation aiming goal, and it fits into that bucket. Our problem was that we made those buckets a little bit too square and that they need to be a little bit more flexible. And we did that because of a lot of public comment that they needed consistency. They wanted to see consistency across sites. But what we've learned in managing for conservation and use is that you have to get complicated with your rules and your regulations and your designations if you want to allow for both things. And you can see this reflected in Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife's rules for fishing with respect to rivers, particularly every single stretch and every little part of a river is different in how it's managed, both to conserve populations of salmon, but also to allow for use. So here's what I see missing. A lot of concerns from parks I recognize, and I feel like those are the biggest concerns in the room. And as a recreational user, I listen to those very carefully. What I'm not hearing is the opportunity, because I believe that Parks agrees with the goals of this proposal. And so there's some challenges here that I believe that could be met with some conservation monitoring, because there's tipping points here that maybe Fran and the conservation community feels like we're going to go past. There's allowable use that Parks and others want to allow at this site. But if we want to preserve this site for the long-term use, we can't allow that scale of population that Moses talked about to continue using. I also think that this site is very unique with respect to attracting a crowd because of a designation. It already has a crowd. So it's not like Crook Point. It's not out there in the middle of nowhere. It's right in the middle of a pretty busy population. So there's really good points around both equity of use, but also around the rising, use of this area. I would recognize that places like Dee River were the most popular places in Oregon for many, many decades without any type of designation. That's just because of where they were. So those are things that sort of come to mind. Being a yes man and trying to wrap this up rather than ramble, I'll just say that what I think about this site is I think that we should look at how to meet these goals and look at an RFP potentially around long-term monitoring of these tipping points that would initiate certain rules and regulations when required, if required, but still allow for regular use. Maybe that's now. Maybe the monitoring hasn't been done in those conservation areas, or those conservation issues are already being degraded. We wouldn't know because we don't have good monitoring at that site. So what tells me here is that Parks lacks information to make these types of decisions potentially. They want to allow for a lot of use. We want to allow for conservation. We need to monitor that. And that's not what we have going on here. So at the very least, to meet conservation goals from the long term, I think there should be an RFP for this site around to meet those around long-term monitoring. So I'll just leave it at that. If this doesn't meet the designation, I would really want to see an RFP around this to meet those long-term conservation goals.
Thank you, Charlie. Margaret said that she has more of a question than a comment, but go ahead, Margaret.
Okay, so, I think Charlie just did a really nice job just thinking about sort of how these proposals could align with some of the goals. And my question is kind of related to that, in that I was just, when agencies were talking and we're kind of in the feasibility kind of components again, right? And, as an OPAC member, I'm also looking like at those policies in the TSP, really to guide some of like how these sites are like selected or whatever. And so I was just wondering if agencies, like how agencies, somebody on the call can just like clarify for me, or how you've thought about it, some of the agencies, just how you're weighting that feasibility, the expectations of the feasibility with the TSP, the greater TSP policies, because they're your implementing policies too, right? As an implementing agency, they're your policies. And so then you have your own agency priorities, which I've heard Laurel kind of reflect a couple of times, thinking about equity of access. And I think that it's not that it's vacant from the TSP. It's not vacant from the TSP, but I would say it's not in black and white the way some other components of site proposals are. And so I just was wondering like how you balance the priorities of your agency with the priorities in the TSP, and when they're inconsistent, I guess. Sometimes I think they're consistent, sometimes they're maybe less consistent. And so I just wanted to like pose that question. I have to think about it as a OPAC member too, like how I'm incorporating agency feasibility into like my considerations of whether or not I think this is a good proposal or not. So I'm just wondering if you guys have thoughts on that right now.
Margaret, that's a great question. I'm going to allow and give my agency partners the courtesy of answering that first. Thoughts on how you would respond?
So just briefly and vaguely, I think it is an excellent question. So thank you for asking it. And the challenge, I think, is really answering it, or being able to answer it without really diving into the specific circumstances that are going to exist. And that can be as specific as a site-by-site determination or something a little bit more broad. But that's the challenge that I see, and really, being able to do a quality job at providing a response there.
Thanks, Dave. I saw you come off mute for a moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. Really broad, sweeping question. And I agree that a lot of it comes down to the details. But in general, at least my read of the revised Rocky Habitat Management Strategy, one of the core goals is conservation while allowing for appropriate use. So the fact that we're having all these detailed kind of, where's that balance with conservation of use? I think that those discussions are really consistent with, how the Rocky Habitat Strategy is set up, because it doesn't just say close everything and stop, certain kinds of use. It has that allowance, and it's something that the natural resource agencies, that's finding that balance is their job. It's kind of 100% of our job. And that's, where these details come down to is, equity of access, the other opportunities that even if 95% of the public wants something one way, we still have to think about that other 5%. And make allowances where it's appropriate, where it still allows for sustainability. As far as the part of the, sorry for the vague answer, but again, it's a sweeping question. But as far as the part of the question about agency priorities, when we look at managing harvest in particular, we have, like any agency, like any group, anybody, you have limited resources, you have a limited number of people, limited budget. So you really have to focus your energies primarily on where the big either problems are or where the big potential problems are. And really, for us in the marine environment, we have to focus a lot of our effort on, commercial fisheries or the bigger recreational fisheries, because that's where we have to be most vigilant in terms of, trying to maintain sustainability. So no matter what we do in a lot of these areas, our most of our efforts still going to be devoted to that sort of thing. So that's not inconsistent with the Rocky Shore strategy. It's just that we're limited in, in how much we can do, and that's where it comes down to, can we do monitoring? Can we do public education and such? It usually, unless there's some separate funding source or something like that, the answer is probably usually it's going to fall way down on our priority list, just because the areas where we could have, if we're not vigilant, we could have like a sudden population crash or something like that. That's where we devote our effort. I don't know if that's clear. I'm not saying it's a low priority. I'm just saying that because of limited resources, we have to focus a lot of our effort on other things.
Yeah, Guy and Dave, I think you've hit the balance that I think is a big challenge for all of us agencies as we're considering these questions. I myself, when I think about the role of my agency in the stewardship of the Territorial Sea Plan, I go back to the principles in statewide land use planning goal 19, which is the long-term ecological and economic benefit to the state, which is provided by a healthy ecological system. And really if there's any tiebreaker in the balance between conservation and use because of unknowns, then I think that the scales tip towards conservation because of the precautionary principle. That being said, we as an agency don't manage the fish or the wildlife resources or the shoreline that our other agencies do manage. So, they have to implement goal 19 and the Territorial Sea Plan through their activities as best that we can. And I would, in the big policy question and the policy arenas where, it's not a clear-cut answer, then we do look towards the guidance of our Ocean Policy Advisory Council to help the state, move forward on that balance. So that's what I would say as a DLCD staffer when I think about agencies moving forward to implement the Territorial Sea Plan. We obviously want to have that balance between conservation and use, because we recognize that we as humans find value in our ecosystems because we're able to use them, because we benefit from them in so many other ways, but that they do have inherent values in and of themselves. So that would be my answer to your very tough question, Margaret. And I think it's a really probing one, and it's something that does go to the heart of what is the Ocean Policy Advisory Council's role in helping the state set policy. So I don't see any other requests for comment and or questions. So what I will do is kind of share the screen again just to touch on and remind folks about the next steps in this process. So I will work to put together a summary. The meeting has been recorded, so it will be available as a part of the public record. But I will work with our agencies to produce a summary of our discussion and the considerations. We will allow Fran to generate a cover letter for her site proposal, addressing any comments she's heard from us as a panel and any other future modifications to her proposal that she would like to make in response to those. And those materials will be compiled and provided to OPAC along with the other materials that have been produced through the initial process that resulted in the proposal coming to us. The proposals will be presented to OPAC at their first meeting of the year, where they will have an opportunity to have a question and answer dialogue session with our presenters. And then they will come back together in the fall of 2022, and we've asked them to make a decision on these proposals at that time. So just kind of specifically thinking about public comment opportunities associated with those events. Comments will be accepted ahead of the meeting. I'm hoping June we can find a time when we will have enough OPAC members to have a quorum. If not, it may need to get pushed into July. But we will have a public comment opportunity associated with that meeting. There will be public comment opportunities at the fall 2022 meeting. And then, of course, if the site does move forward, there will be a last opportunity at the commission. And with that, I believe we have wrapped up our Fogarty Creek Marine Conservation Area workshop for today. I really want to thank everyone for their participation. I see a hand up. Maybe I'll just, if there's a question, go ahead, Peggy, before I
I just
adjourn.
wanted to say thanks to everyone today. This is, I'm newly appointed to the board. I previously sat in on many of the TSP revisions and writings and communications, and I was very impressed with the staff and people at that point. But I am today truly impressed with especially the department people who have shown up today and shared their information and their insight, because it's you guys who are on the front lines who basically have to interact every day with people who utilize these resources in our state that some of us, most of us, would like to desperately keep going for generations to come. And it just, from the scientific information that's coming in, it's just going to be, I mean, I just feel devastated by the information that I'm seeing coming out in some of these scientific studies. So we really have our work cut out for us. And I just want to thank every single person here. And I am really sorry that not every single board member is sitting in on these discussions, because this is so, so useful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy. I guess I'm open to allowing others. Joe, you were recently appointed to OPAC as well. Go ahead.
Can I comment quickly here?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on Peggy's comment that yes, I'm new to OPAC, and I appreciate everyone's time today. And I also want to really thank Fran too for all the work she's put into this. It's amazing. And I guess a quick question for Andy, looking at the packet of material that will be sent to OPAC to be able to make a decision on, I am a little concerned just to understand exactly how OPAC is going to make these decisions. It seems like it's going to be a very kind of subjective process, because there's no ranking, there's no kind of quantitative way to make this judgment. So is that true? And just want to get some clarity on that from you, if there is any clarity.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I guess my first take on it is that as a working group, we recognize the merit in these proposals, but we identified that there were considerations that were still concerning to agencies with implementation. And this process that we've designed here is designed to allow OPAC to hear the original proposal along with any modifications to that proposal that were made by the proposal entities, and whether or not those modifications fully addressed the considerations and potential concerns that still are there. If they did, then the assumed recommendation would be that the site would move forward for designation. In a case like we have today, where there's, I think, still some uncertainty about the topic of equity of access, or uncertainty about the ability to do enforcement, then it really does go towards the judgment of our OPAC members in their collective knowledge and their subjective thinking to make the call on each of these sites. And that is the way that OPAC has made those decisions in the past. And I don't see any cause to change that kind of policy making and development process now, given that, that's really, for all the flaws that our initial proposal process had, we want to communicate the good ideas that still exist and communicate any uncertainties around them. And at the end of the day, it will be the policymakers at OPAC that help the state make a choice on these sites. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all. For those of you who are going to join us for the Cape Fowl weather conversation, that will begin at 1 o'clock. So thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Andy.